Okay, so thank you so much for joining us for today's Community Legal Centres Queensland webinar on managing psychosocial hazards in community legal centres. My name's Carly Hanson and I'm one of the Sector Sustainability Coordinators at Community Legal Centres Queensland. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're holding today's webinar. In Meanjin, Brisbane, they are the Turrbal and the Yagara people. I wish to pay my respect to their elders past, present and future and acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty was never ceded. As today's webinar is being viewed by people across Queensland and Australia, I'd also like to pay my deep respects to the traditional owners throughout the country and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people who are listening today. So today I'm really pleased to welcome Andrew Vidmansky, Senior Associate, and Morgan O'Shane, Associate from Allen's Lawyers, who will be presenting today's session. So essentially, as many of us know, working in community legal centres and non-legal community support services can pose industry-specific challenges to employees' mental wellbeing. COVID-19 has also introduced, exacerbated and modified many of the challenges facing employees. This webinar will explore how employers can manage psychosocial risks in accordance with workplace health and safety frameworks in order to create mentally healthy workplaces. So today, Andrew and Morgan will take us through the meaning and importance of psychosocial safety in the workplace, employers' legal obligations in respect of employees' psychosocial health, how to manage psychosocial risks, and psychosocial risks associated with working in the community legal sector specifically. So I'll hand over to Andrew and Morgan in just a moment and let them tell you a bit more about themselves. But firstly, I'll just take you through some quick housekeeping. So today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have the recording available for you to download later this afternoon or tomorrow. The PowerPoints have been emailed out to everyone who registered and I'll in a moment pop them onto the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel for you to download if you didn't pick them up earlier. I really encourage you to ask questions while we've got our expert presenters with us. So simply type your question into the question box on the control panel and I'll read that question out at the end. Do feel free to type them in as you think of them. There will also be a bit of a scenario case study posed during the session. So I'd also encourage you to use the question box or the chat box to type in your thoughts and comments in relation to that scenario when it's presented. So I'll now hand over to our presenters, Andrew and Morgan, to get us started. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Carly, for that great introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. As Carly said, my name is Andrew Widmansky. I'm a Senior Associate in the Employment and Safety team at Allen's Brisbane, and I'm joined by...
I'm Morgan. As Carly said, I'm an associate in the Brisbane Employment and Safety team at Allen's.
Excellent. And so we would also like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the original inhabitants of the land on which this webinar is taking place. We recognise the country north and south of the Brisbane River as the home of both the Turrbal and Yagara nations, and we pay our deep respects to all elders, past and present. So today's presentation is about raising your awareness about the important role you play in meeting your work health and safety obligations in the context of worker mental health and psychosocial safety. We'll be discussing the workplace health and safety framework, and we'll also consider some of the specific hazards that have been exacerbated by the pandemic and consider what employers can be doing to address those hazards. So Morgan, if you tick over to next slide, I will hand you over to Morgan to explain those in some more depth. And Morgan, just initially, I think we're still on the title slide. That's all good, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry, Andrew. I am having some trouble getting it to click over. There we go. Sorry, there is our beautiful artwork that we were hoping to show you during the acknowledgement of country, but we'll move on past that now. So thank you, Andrew. I guess the first question we're going to start off with is, what is workplace psychosocial safety and why is it important? In an employment context, psychosocial safety relates to the identification, elimination, and management of the work-related hazards that cause workplace stress and impact the mental health of workers. All workplaces have psychosocial hazards. While some hazards, such as bullying and harassment, can occur at any workplace, others are more industry specific. And we've identified some general psychosocial hazards on the slide here. So a related question is, why is it important that employers invest in workers' psychological health? And I'm acknowledging that I'm probably preaching to the converted here a little bit, but workplace stress can have a profound impact on both individuals and employers. It can affect an individual's physical and psychological health, as well as resulting in unhealthy behaviours. So some physical, psychological, and behavioural health impacts of workplace stress are set out on this slide here. In addition to the impact workplace stress can have on an individual, there are multiple good business reasons for looking after employees' mental health. And multiple studies show that a mentally healthy workplace increases productivity, reduces absenteeism, and reduces staff turnover. All of this enhances an organization's brand, attracting high-quality employees, and is beneficial for clients. So we've covered why it's important to invest in employees' psychological health. Andrew will now discuss the relevant legal obligations in this space.
Thanks, Morgan. So as you can see on the next slide, there are several legal sources of obligations that an employer has in relation to mental health. I think one of the most important and topical ones at the moment relates to sexual harassment laws. You may have all seen in the news and in the legal developments that there have been a range of amendments in the law following the Respect at Work report that was issued last year, and a package of various legal amendments. One of those is the expansion in the Sex Discrimination Act of prohibited harassment, which is now expanded to include harassment on the ground of sex. It's similar in the way it works to the existing prohibition on sexual harassment, but it's intended to capture conduct that sort of previously fell in between the gaps between sexual harassment and sex discrimination, such as making seriously demeaning sexist remarks. Additionally, the Fair Work Commission has also recently gained a new anti-sexual harassment jurisdiction, which includes the ability to make stop harassment orders. That's also part of those Respect at Work legislative reforms. That jurisdiction commenced on 11 September last year, and so far there's only been one published decision. It's not a particularly helpful decision because that decision basically meant that the Commission found there was no risk of further bullying or sexual harassment occurring in the future, and therefore did not actually make an order. But I think it's something that we can expect to see more of in the future as more people bring applications under that jurisdiction. Another obviously important area is workers' compensation, which really comes into play, particularly when rehabilitation obligations come to the fore. So dealing with people who have suffered some sort of harm or injury from any sort of impact on their mental health. We've got other issues there, such as tort, contracts, and so on. But another very crucial piece of the puzzle relates to workplace health and safety legislation. And this is where we're going to focus in today's presentation, because that is really, I think, the linchpin of how an employer's and other people's obligations come together to protect psychosocial health and well-being of employees. And so that's what we're going to turn to next. So in meeting your health and safety obligations, it's essential to have a systemic approach to psychological health and safety. Employers need to prevent harm from occurring wherever possible, but if it does occur, they should intervene as early as possible and support the employee's recovery. Safe Work Australia issued a very useful national guidance in this regard called Work-Related Psychological Health and Safety, a Systematic Approach to Meeting Your Duties. Now, there's a best practice framework that's in that guide, and we've set it out on the slide in front of you. So you'll see that it's a sort of circle of life. We're looking at each of the elements in turn. The first element is to prevent harm. This includes identifying risks and hazards, assessing the risks, implementing effective control measures to eliminate or minimize risk, and consulting effectively. Secondly, there's the importance of intervening early. This includes reviewing control measures proactively where possible and changing them as required, and supporting those who show early signs of stress. The third element is to support recovery. Now, this principally relates to having effective return to work processes and preventing further harm. The inner circle shows the things that should be happening throughout all three stages of the process on an ongoing basis. Now, this includes things like having training, monitoring people's health and well-being, and importantly, consulting, cooperating, and coordinating to ensure a safe and healthy workplace. So now that we've explored Safe Work Australia's framework for managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace, the next question, Morgan, is who actually has the duties to manage the hazards?
Thanks, Andrew. The short answer is that basically everyone involved in a workplace has health and safety duties. And so we've set these out in the slide. And so the primary duty of care rests with the PCBU, and that is persons conducting a business or undertaking. This is a really broad term, and it's meant to capture most legal entities. It includes not-for-profit organisations as long as they engage and pay staff, but it won't include entirely volunteer organisations. So a PCBU must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers engaged or caused to be engaged by the PCBU, and workers whose activities in carrying out work are influenced or directed by the PCBU, while the workers are at work in the business or undertaking. A PCBU can't transfer or delegate any of its duties to another person, so there's no getting away from these duties, nor can they contract out of them in any way. But what they can do and what they're encouraged to do is consult, cooperate, and coordinate with other PCBUs to do the things that will assist them in meeting the duties under the Act. The second category we've identified there of duty holders is officers. So officers includes people such as company directors, senior managers, and executives of government agencies, and they have an immediate, positive, and proactive duty to exercise due diligence to ensure the PCBU complies with the relevant Act and regulations. Workers also have workplace health and safety obligations. So while at work, a worker must take reasonable care for their own health and safety, take reasonable care that their acts or omissions do not adversely affect the health and safety of other persons, comply so far as the worker is reasonably able with any reasonable instruction that is given by the PCBU to allow the person to comply with the Workplace Health and Safety Act, and they have to cooperate with any reasonable policy or procedure of the PCBU relating to health or safety at the workplace that has been notified to the workers. And lastly, we've got very broad categories, other persons. So a person present at a workplace actually has obligations under workplace health and safety. So like a worker, they have to take reasonable care for their own health and safety. We'll now take a bit of a deep dive into exploring what are psychosocial hazards, including what hazards have been particularly exacerbated in the last few years by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first step, as you can imagine, is identifying the hazards in the workplace. And the first step here is to think about your workplace and potential sources of hazards to psychological health, including some of these things that we've set out on the slide here. So the nature and type of work undertaken by your organization, interactions and behaviors between people at work that impact workers and others, characteristics and attributes of your officers, managers and supervisors and other workers, and also whenever significant change is planned or underway, such as downsizing, organizational restructures, and introducing new technologies or work arrangements. The next thing to do is actually ask your employees. So we recommend sending out a survey or having managers ask employees. It's really crucial that employees are encouraged to speak up if they are feeling overwhelmed. We recommend including the option to complete surveys anonymously, as this can really improve the quality of the information that's received. Information such as incident reports, workers' compensation claims, staff surveys, absenteeism and staff turnover data will also provide important data points to determine where the hazards in a business are. However, these are lag indicators and they're only going to reveal an already existing problem, so they shouldn't be favoured over taking a proactive approach to hazard identification. With hazard identification, the trend is your friend. So we really recommend that you look at the most commonly identified issues and those issues that are being raised often by employees to help guide your response. Now, we'd like to take a second here just to ask all of you to reflect upon the workplaces in the community legal sector that you've been involved in and reflect on any hazards you may have witnessed or could imagine witnessing. So please feel free to write some of them down in the chat or raise your hand and just share potential hazards that are particularly prevalent or relevant to the community legal sector.
And as a point of terminology, hazards, you can think of a hazard as a potential source of harm or danger. So, so in health and safety law, we talk about hazards and risks. So a hazard, for example, could be a wet floor, and the risks are what are the bad things that could happen because of it. So, for example, the risk that someone will slip and fall. So that's what we mean when we say hazards. They're potential sources of danger or harm to a person.
Has anyone identified there anything, Carly? Are you able to read any potential hazards aloud for us?
So nothing's come through yet, but I might just throw out a couple of suggestions that you know, are relatively common in the community legal sector in terms of hazards. So it could be, and correct me if I'm wrong in regards to the hazards versus risks, but it could be, you know, hearing people's stories of abuse. That one actually came through. Thank you to Penny. It could be hearing or speaking to angry and stressed clients. That's coming through now. So there's a risk of abuse from clients. So the clients themselves could be a hazard. Just reading through this one here. Some people are sort of saying, I think maybe potentially what would be the risk from this kind of thing. So things like vicarious trauma, mental health issues, stress and fear by staff. Certainly, I think other things like overwork, you know, needing to meet particular service delivery targets, unrealistic workloads has come through. Burnout and stress, again, as potential risks from some of the hazards. So heaps of great stuff coming through now. High expectations.
Oh, sorry, I've gone and skipped ahead there. I've given the answers away. I think people have picked up on most of them already.
Yes, and staff bullying and harassment has also just come through. So thanks so much for sharing, everyone.
everyone's nailed it. You've got all the answers. Yeah, Carly, one of the key ones that you picked up straight away is that secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And that's a hazard that lawyers, all lawyers, but particularly lawyers who work in certain areas such as community legal sectors, are at risk of experiencing. We've put a definition up on the slides there of secondary trauma, and it's from a great resource called Being Well in the Law, a guide for lawyers. And this resource also states that the signs of secondary trauma can mirror those of primary trauma. So they're signs such as having intrusive memories of what the client has told you, of the material you've seen, of not being able to switch off from a matter, of being irritable towards other people, including partners, friends, and family members. So that's definitely a key risk for people who work in areas where they may be dealing with psychologically difficult material such as domestic violence, criminal matters, and child abuse. So any of those kind of areas can create that hazard for workers. And the second hazard we've identified on the slide here is something that also came up, is that high or low work demands. So during COVID-19, we've seen workers be exposed to both ends of this spectrum. And high work demands relates to those unachievable deadlines and insufficient resourcing. So it's a hazard that relates to workloads where there is consistently more to do than there is time to do it in. And on the flip side, we've also seen workers who are underutilized, and this can obviously cause stress as well, particularly if job security is a concern. The third hazard we've got on the slide there is bullying and harassment, and that's including sexual harassment. So according to some commentators, managers and leaders distressed by the pandemic are at increased risk of creating toxic, mentally unsafe workplaces. So managers themselves are at risk of burnout and becoming dysfunctional, and this can lead to behaviours such as yelling, blaming, controlling, micromanaging, and perfectionism, and that has a potentially foreseeable side effect to the people that they're managing. There's also concerns that sexual harassment is becoming harder to detect because of remote working, and that it's going to go unreported if employees are concerned about job security. Alternatively, there are reports that sexual harassment might be decreasing because we're no longer interacting as much in person. And the last hazard we've got up there is remote and isolated work. So some people love working from home and others can't stand it. And they find that going into work provides them with a great sense of connection. There's also added hazards where some employees don't have adequate arrangements at home to work successfully. So they may be struggling with poor IT, poor ergonomics, carers' responsibility, or domestic violence. So in relation to domestic violence, employers should be aware that an employee may not want to say that this is a risk that they are facing working from home, and when possible, should be giving those employees the option to opt in from working from another location, including the office. So employers should also inform employees of the supports that are available to them. That said, we recommend that any DV-related resources should not be provided on their own, but instead embedded in emails that relate to wellbeing generally, to decrease the chances of an email prompting any sort of dangerous response from a perpetrator. I'll hand over to you now, Andrew, to discuss how to assess risks after you've identified hazards.
Thanks very much, Morgan. So what you need to do now is to consider what could happen if someone is exposed to the risks arising from a hazard, and then assess each risk separately. The two key things when you're assessing a risk is what's the likelihood that it will occur, and what are the consequences? What could the potential consequences be? But you also need to consider other things like what's the source of the risk, who's exposed to it, how urgently action needs to be taken, and those other things I mentioned, such as the potential consequences. Only then can you control the risk. When it comes to risk assessments, your co-workers and employees are your greatest asset. each workplace is different. So you do need to talk to your employees and co-workers about the environment. This can be done through informal conversations or other more structured means, such as the People at Work survey, which I'll talk a bit more about a bit later. The risk identification and control process should occur whenever a new hazard is identified or a change is being considered, such as a restructure, for example, or a different way of delivering services. However, an effective safety system has within it a process that continually reviews risks and controls to ensure their adequacy. So the important point here is that it's not set and forget. It's something that, as we said when we talked about that broader framework, there are certain things you should be doing on a continuous basis, and monitoring and reviewing your hazards, risks, and controls is one of those. So if we look at the next slide, that shows you some example questions from the People at Work survey that I mentioned earlier. It's a free tool that was developed by the various Australian health and safety regulators to assess a number of the most common psychosocial hazards and factors. And that involves the staff in an organisation answering various survey questions. We don't have time to go into it in depth, but there are some excellent resources on that website that we've got up on the slide, peopleatwork.gov.au, and they can sort of help you lay the groundwork and prepare for having that sort of survey. Another useful tool is one that was issued by Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, and that's a psychosocial risk assessment tool. And that is a really helpful way to run through some of the key things you need to be thinking about during this process in a structured way. So once you've identified the hazards and assessed the risks, you can then understand what must be controlled and how to go about doing it. So as you can see up there, some control measures are more effective than others. They're ranked in this sort of inverted pyramid from the highest level of protection and reliability to the lowest. And this is called the hierarchy of controls. Eliminating the risk is your gold standard. It's the most reliable and highest level of control. This is always the most desirable way to control a risk if possible, and it should be done so far as is reasonably practicable. For example, if excessive workload has been identified as a hazard, can you eliminate it by outsourcing or getting rid of certain tasks, setting more achievable performance targets, or bringing on more staff? If a risk cannot be eliminated, then you need to minimize it so far as is reasonably practicable. This could include monitoring workloads on an ongoing basis, providing workers with reasonable control over their work, such as when they can take breaks, and allowing more time to staff with less experience for them to complete difficult tasks. Another potential hazard, of course, is if someone is involved in very traumatic work. We mentioned that secondary trauma before, and there are risks if someone is continually exposed to horrific stories and experiences of others. So maybe you can't eliminate it if that's, you know, the central rationale for your organization, or one of the key services you provide. But perhaps one strategy to minimize the risk is to spread those kinds of cases more evenly around a team, so that it's not all sitting with just one or two people. Further down the hierarchy, we'll skip past engineering controls. They're not really that relevant to psychosocial hazards. So further down, administrative controls are the least reliable form of risk management because they rely on worker behavior and supervision. So this includes things such as having a bullying and harassment policy, providing training on an organization's expectations, and things of that nature. They're all good and important things, but on their own, they're unlikely to be enough. That's why, as much as possible, administrative controls should be used in conjunction with other controls to eliminate or minimize risk. The last method is using PPE, but again, that's not as relevant for psychosocial hazards. So Morgan, once you've assessed and controlled the risks, what do you do next?
Thanks, Andrew. The next step is reviewing. So I'm sure you could probably guess that. As Andrew was saying, this is not a set and forget process. So an employer should be constantly reviewing hazard management as well as the control measures that are in place. So there should be an ongoing review to ensure that your processes and measures are properly responding to hazards. And this slide identifies some of these triggers for reviewing hazard and control measures. So I'm sure many of you have seen policies, employment policies that have agreed dates for reviewing the policy. So agreed dates is one of those key areas where you should be reviewing hazards and controls that are in place. When a new hazard is identified, on if there's a request, where there's consultation indicates that a review is necessary. Before a significant workplace change is also a great opportunity to review any hazards and control measures. And then also, if a control measure is not adequately minimizing the risk, that's also an opportunity for a review there. So as you can see on this PowerPoint here, most psychosocial hazards should be identified during routine risk assessments. But a PCBU needs to have processes in place to manage reports of psychosocial hazards by workers. So duty holders should create an organisational culture that actively supports early reporting of psychosocial hazards. So we've mentioned it earlier, but your employees are your strongest asset in this space. And that's at all stages of the process, from identifying hazards all the way through to here when you're reviewing them. It's also necessary, potentially necessary, that if a hazard isn't controlled, there'll be an incident and an investigation needs to occur. So investigations should be conducted in a fair, timely, and balanced way to try to find out what happened and why, and what can be done to improve the controls so that the incident does not occur again. And the focus should be on incident prevention rather than assigning blame. This process is typically more comprehensive than those used as part of the normal hazard identification and risk assessment process. PCBUs should also be aware of their obligations in respect of notifiable incidents. So in Queensland, a PCBU has to notify WorkSafe Queensland immediately after becoming aware of a notifiable incident arising out of the conduct of the business or undertaking. A notifiable incident is where any of the following occur at a workplace or is caused by the running of the business. So it's the death of a person, a serious injury or illness of a person, a dangerous incident where a person was exposed to a serious risk to their health or safety from an immediate or imminent exposure to certain hazards. The regulations have a much more detailed list of some of those hazards, but an example of one is an uncontrolled fire. So they're all very serious incidents, as you can tell. That's why they're notifiable incidents. It's really important that PCBUs are complying there and notifying WorkSafe Queensland when they occur or if they occur. So we've prepared a case study for you all to consider and apply some of the issues and skills that we've discussed today. And I've set up the details on the next slide and think, Andrew, do you want to speak everyone through this?
Sure, thanks, Morgan. So in our case study, we have a community legal centre. It provides legal advice to clients experiencing mental health difficulties. Aggressive and violent behaviour is common. Sometimes it's linked to the client's clinical condition, or sometimes some of those behaviours are due to client frustrations and/or drug and alcohol abuse. Workplace culture discourages reporting of all but the most serious incidents and accepts that client aggression is part of the job. Workers regularly witness violent incidents. High workloads and new policies requiring increased documentation frustrate workers by taking them away from direct client engagement. So that's an adapted example scenario from the code of practicing managing psychosocial hazards at work down south in New South Wales. And so we'll give you all a moment now. Can anyone identify the potential psychosocial hazards in this scenario? Feel free to share your ideas in the chat and Carly can read them out aloud.
Okay, so there's some comments coming through and please keep them coming. So Simone's identified client behaviours, aggression and violence. We've got stress and workloads, high workloads, stress and fear, discouraging reporting of less serious issues, trauma, vicarious trauma again, very popular one.
Yeah. Well, the attendees have nailed it. They've really captured all the key hazards and risk factors in this scenario. So you've got potentially role overload, where there aren't enough workers to manage client behaviours, particularly if client aggression is high, and if there's a poor skills mix with maybe too few experienced people on a roster, that could be an issue. You could also, the increased demands from new systems of work compete with existing workloads. So again, that can worsen the issues. People have rightly identified that by, secondary trauma, exposure to traumatic events, or even direct exposure if people are seeing violence occur directly. Ongoing exposure to violent incidents has a cumulative effect on workers. And obviously those who respond to incidents are at high risk of injury themselves. And obviously there's a risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and other issues as a result. And there's also that risk of not having appropriate supports in place if there's role overload. We've alluded to occupational violence as well, where workers have regular exposure to both threats and actual violence from clients. Inadequate rostering means that there aren't enough trained workers potentially available on all shifts to participate in violence prevention. So there are quite a few issues arising in this case study. Can anyone identify some of the controls that could be useful in managing the risks arising from these hazards? I might let Morgan, once people have had a chance and Carly will share with everyone, Morgan might take us through some of the controls.
Thanks, Andrew. I just thought I might add there as well. Andrew and I have spoken about how often these hazards interact with each other and can have a snowballing effect. So I think you said there, Andrew, how exposure to traumatic events is occurring in a workplace, and that's a hazard, but then potentially it's not dealt with appropriately because there's also role overload and you've also got occupational violence. So as everyone identified, there's a lot of hazards happening here, and they shouldn't be viewed individually. That interaction and how they have a snowballing effect on employees is really something to take into account, I think.
So some great suggestions coming through the chat. Mental health training for workers, better reporting and debriefing, reporting of all incidents and streamlining the reporting process, reviewing themes and consideration of changes to mitigate the hazards, access to regular supervision and external EAP, employee assistance programs, appropriate policies and procedures, sharing the workload between different people being a really key point as well, staff training, requirements to report all incidents, making sure the physical environment supports safety, procedures and protocols to assist with safety, regular check-ins with each other, so checking that people in the workplace are okay, supervision and debriefing, having a social worker in the interview with the solicitors perhaps, focusing on culture and peer-to-peer support, a better culture regarding reporting concerns with volatile clients. Oh, sorry, hang on, I think that might be having a social worker in the interview with volatile clients. Sorry, that came through two separate comments. Physical barriers to make staff feel safer, reporting near misses, personal alarms, EAP we've mentioned, and training we've mentioned, and communication improvement. So heaps of really great ideas. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, once again, everyone has really nailed it. It's like you work in the industry and know what would work. Crazy. So we've identified some as well, and all ones I think that you've already identified there. So role overload and occupational violence you can attempt to manage that through rostering adequate worker numbers to take into account new systems of work, client aggression, staff skills mix, and ensure that there are adequately trained workers on all shifts to respond effectively to violent incidents. An escalation process could be implemented to senior leadership to make quick decisions to respond to early warning signs. An exposure to traumatic events could be managed by holding debriefs with staff afterwards and offering access to counselling services, as was identified, EAP services, if needed. So a key thing here is, and it's part of that review process we talked about, is that different controls are going to work in different organisations. I'm sure you can all imagine, the size of the organisation is going to make a big impact upon what sort of control is needed. Do you need just another manager working during a particular difficult clinic, for example, or does there need to be some sort of more formal escalation process in place? And that's where listening to your employees and reviewing the processes that you have, the controls that you have put in place, is really key.
And I guess one key thing, of course, is that a lot of organisations in the community legal sector face quite serious budget constraints. And so there may not be the budget to implement every single potential control measure. And if that's the case, that's where that risk assessment and identifying the most important, urgent, severe risks with the most catastrophic potential consequences, that's where that becomes particularly crucial, so that you can focus your resources on the areas that will have the greatest impact in delivering a safe and healthy workplace.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that, Andrew. I was just going to ask if you wanted to talk through some resources and strategies.
Awesome, thanks, Morgan. So on the next slide, we've sort of listed some of the key strategies that organisations can use to sort of build that culture of care, which is really important, because one of the most corrosive things in an organisation is if people feel unheard, if they're just a number, and if the organisation doesn't care about their well-being. And the most significant step, we think, is for employers for want of a better way, to see their people and keep their eyes on their people, but not in a creepy way. Important to add. This can be as simple as organising regular, meaningful, and where possible, in-person catch-ups with staff. Obviously, that's not always possible, so sometimes you have to settle for virtual catch-ups. The use of visual communications also has a tendency to feel more organic than simply emailing one another. But again, it's important that you tailor your approach. You don't just have a cookie cutter approach, but tailor your strategy to your people and what they like and don't like. So sometimes people really value a video conference, but other times they value their privacy more. If, you know, if their room is a mess, they've had a crazy time and they don't want you to see them, maybe a phone call is better sometimes. So, you know, you have to be adaptive and flexible. It's particularly important to maintain those connections when dealing with employees who may be vulnerable or who are just starting in the organization or are relatively junior. As Morgan mentioned, particularly crucial for those going through domestic and family violence. So as we've mentioned before, if an employer is aware that it's unsafe for an employee to work from home, if there are any sudden changes in mood or behavior or potential warning signs that cause concern, and if it is possible to allow them to work in the office, then those arrangements should be made. Likewise, organising a regular meeting in the office on a particular day can be another good way of maintaining support and connection for that individual and creating a setting in which they can safely raise concerns if they need to, so that they're away from the source of the danger and the harm. It's also important to ensure that not all communications are simply work-related. So managers and supervisors should take the time to just check in with employees to see how they're going and how they're handling these strange times. Engagement on a human level is not only important for facilitating relationships between colleagues, but it's just generally significant when many are physically isolated from their usual support networks. So no doubt last year, one of the big things was those virtual trivia quizzes. They were a real flavor of the month, or virtual coffees, virtual, you know, catch-up drinks. These are all different strategies that have been used to maintain connection and a sense of belonging. And we have, and as many of you have rightly identified, EAP is another important strategy. And I should add, with those sort of things we mentioned before, like the virtual trivia nights and things of that nature, it's important not to have mandated fun. Sometimes people are just exhausted and they just want to spend time with their family, obviously. So having that flexibility and ensuring that it's voluntary is also important in promoting that work-life balance. So if we turn
Andrew,
to the next...
speaking from experience there, from me trying to enforce fun activities on the team, I think.
No, you were pretty good. I think I was at another employer where we had these weekly trivia things on a Friday afternoon when, you know, you're exhausted from the whole week. And as much as you may love your colleagues, sometimes the last thing you want to do on a Friday afternoon is spend time with them. You know, you want to spend time with others. But, you know, everyone's different. So if we turn to the next slide, developing a mental health strategy. This is I guess, one of the more proactive ways that an organization can try to ensure employee well-being. So there are some resources there on the screen that can help. The key factors are, it's important to have buy-in from the leadership. It's important to identify what your employees need. I think today's session was an excellent example that the best people, obviously, to know where the problem areas are and potential solutions are the people on the ground experiencing the issues. You don't need someone coming in and doing some sort of top-down analysis. Once you've identified what it is that people in the organization need, you then develop a plan to respond to those needs, and you ensure that the document is a living document through constant monitoring, review, and improvement. So Beyond Blue, excellent organization, really useful resource there. Do the links work, Carly, if people click on them?
Yeah,
I think they do, but if
they should work because it's a PDF document that's been uploaded. So yes, hopefully they will.
Excellent. I think The psychosocial risk assessment tool, that's something that the Queensland regulator developed. That's quite useful. That sort of steps through the four key steps that we mentioned, where you identify the hazards, you assess the risks arising from that, you come up with the control measures, and then you go through that review process. That's quite useful, and maybe we might send a link to you, Carly, or a link to that, and you can share that with attendees who would be interested, in addition to those resources about a mental health strategy that we have up there. So if we go to the next slide, we're getting to key takeaways. So obviously, it's been a running theme throughout today, but being proactive is, prevention better than cure, obviously. So getting in before problems are exacerbated and morph into something that approaches crisis point. Get in early and get it sorted before then, if possible. As we said, keeping clear and open lines of communication with staff and others, with volunteers, is crucial. Also, so that people feel comfortable speaking up and sharing any concerns that they have. We also mentioned that it's important to continually monitor and review, communicate, and get feedback about what's working and what isn't. So you might come up with an excellent, set of control measures before COVID, but obviously once something like that happens, or you go through a big organizational restructure or other big changes, or any of those other trigger points that we mentioned arise, it's important to be continually reviewing and updating your approach to meet the moment. So I think that really is the key stuff that we wanted to go through today. And now there's an opportunity, if anyone wants to ask any questions, fire away.
Thanks so much, Andrew and Morgan. So while those questions are coming in, and you can just pop those into the question box or the chat function on GoToWebinar if you wanted to ask anything. I did want to mention, and I forgot to mention at the beginning, that this webinar is part of CLCQ's Mental Health and Wellbeing CPD program, which is developed to assist frontline CLC workers to manage the impacts of COVID-19, and it's also supported by a grant from the Queensland Community Foundation. So we have had a few webinars in this series already, and we'll have a few more to go up until the end of June, so keep an eye out. So one question that's come through is, and you may have covered some of this already, but how do you right-size your work health and safety responses to mental well-being? So, for example, a safe workplace for a person working in a retail shop will obviously be quite different from someone providing a counselling service for people experiencing sexual violence and everything in between. So, if there's any other additional tips that you would share to sort of make sure your work health and safety responses are fit for purpose?
So I guess the key thing there is, I think the key point where you identify the differences is that hazard identification. That's where and talking to your employees and finding out what are the key issues confronting them. That's where you sort of get that data. So it was as Morgan mentioned in the sort of step one hazard identification, that's where you really start tailoring your response to address the particular needs of your business or organization. Would you add anything to that, Morgan?
Just that review process is really key there as well, because you might implement something and it may not be 100% working. So you listen to employees, you find out where are the gaps, where could it be improved, and then potentially have to change your control so that it's adapted slightly more to your organisation.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come through, and I think this one's quite good. What are some of the red flags that we can watch out for from staff and volunteers, particularly given the limited face-to-face interactions during COVID and work from home or flexible work?
That is a fantastic question. I think we sort of alluded to it earlier. One of them is sudden changes in behavior and mood. If someone's usually really diligent at getting back on things and responding, and suddenly it's, you don't hear from them for long stretches of time. If they just come across as more irritable, more snappy, changes in behavior, I think that's one of the key red flags. If others notice that as well in the workplace or just generally, I think that for me would be the most important red flag. What other ones do you think might be relevant, Morgan?
I think you've nailed it. I think it's about I think most of us know when we see those red flags. It's about making the opportunity to become aware of them. I think that can be key. So being in touch with someone and having virtual or in-person catch-ups is where you're going to be able to see that those changes occur and become aware of the change. And also just making space so that people can raise them with you themselves, and creating a culture where people feel that they are empowered to say, I'm actually struggling here and I need some help. That's really important.
Wonderful. And a couple of people have provided some suggested responses in addition to what you've mentioned to that question. So one is that, people that are normally bubbly and then become withdrawn or quiet could be a bit of a red flag. And also absenteeism. So, I mean, even when people are working from home, they obviously can still access personal leave or sick leave. And so that could be a bit of a red flag as well, potentially.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think we mentioned earlier, like watching for trends. So watching for trends in absenteeism for an individual person's sick leave, and also for sick leave or personal leave across the organisation can be really revealing.
It's important to, if you need to or want to address that, you need to do it in a very delicate way to avoid any risk that the person feels, hounded or discriminated against on the basis that they're using their leave. So it's important to do it in a very, in a way that makes it clear that it's out of a concern for their well-being. Because if they're struggling mentally, then, they may be worried about, how the concern is expressed and whether there'll be an impact on their job security.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important point to note. So I think that's all the questions that we've received for today. So we might wrap the webinar session up now. On behalf of everyone who has joined into today's session, thank you so much to Andrew and Morgan from Allens and for such a great presentation, very thorough, and some really great practical tips as well to help people, ensure that their staff are mentally well and that they're managing those hazards as they arise in their centre. So thank you again also to our attendees for your engagement and for your fantastic suggestions all through the session. So we hope that you've learned something today, and we'd really value your feedback on the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar automatically. So please do give us your thoughts. And we will really hope to see you at the next CLCQ webinar. We've got 2 on next week, so we'll see you there. And thank you so much again. Bye for now.